Introducing our guest will be one of our great friends of the Council, a member since the very beginning of this organization, a member of our Board of Trustees for 2 terms, and at one point the centerpiece of the Republican Party in Maryland, one of our great public servants with respect to the Port of Maryland, and someone known to all of you, the Honorable Helen Bentley.
Thank you, Frank. Dr. Byrd probably wishes that he had not asked me to introduce our speaker tonight. And I'm certain as he's sitting there that he's wondering, what is she going to say? After my phone call today from New York saying, Frank, are you sure you really want me to do it? You see, I happen to be Serbian, and we're going to be talking about the split tonight. But on the way down, Frank, I want you to know that I took one of those nice pills that President Bush used to always question me about. Let me just say that my first meeting with Warren Zimmermann was in Belgrade, ironically in connection with the 600th anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo, which was supposed to be the battle to end all those nasty things in the Balkans at that time. And since then, we have had many overseas telephone exchanges, both in regard to the political picture, the sad breakup, and that has destroyed so many people's lives in that part of the world. I've also been a guest at the embassy when Warren and his wife, Teeny, were very gracious hosts. One of the other things that we did do together was to rescue two American children who had been kidnapped and taken over to Yugoslavia by their father, who was a Serbian, hard-headed Serbian, I might say. None of the others. And the mother was an American, the children were American, so it was good. But I wouldn't be honest if I didn't say that Ambassador Zimmermann and I haven't agreed too much on the turn of events in that war-torn arena. But I was very pleased when the story appeared in the New York Times sometime after he had retired from the ambassador and from the State Department, that he said that one early recognition of the separate republics was probably wrong, and Secretary of State, former Secretary of State Larry Eagleburger had also said that to an audience here in Baltimore in May of '93. But so life goes on, and we now have our good friend. He has been a good friend to the Council. He's been over here on this is 3rd occasion, I think, keeping the Council very active, very alive. And he did serve in Yugoslavia twice. He served first from in the late 60s, and then he became ambassador in '89 and was there until '92. And decided that 33 years in the Foreign Service was kind of demanding, and he decided to step down, and he's now a professor. And he is the Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Professor in the practice of international diplomacy at Columbia University, and has also taught at the Nitze School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins. He's a senior consultant at RAND and is a distinguished fellow at the New School for Social Research. And he and Teenie have made their home in the Washington area. And Warren, we do welcome you here very much.
I have to dispute that Helen has taken nice pills. She's always nice. She's right that we haven't always agreed on policy toward Yugoslavia and in the former Yugoslavia. But there's one thing I think that we both have agreed on throughout, which was the effort to settle these incredible problems of the Balkans peacefully. Helen worked as a congresswoman indefatigably with her Serbian connections, her connections in Belgrade, to try to keep things from escalating into war. And I think I've always thought that she deserves a tremendous degree of admiration for that. Helen, I don't think you're going to agree with much of what I say tonight either. But I'm going to say it anyway. I just published a book on some of the problems that Helen Bentley alluded to. It's an attempt to describe the time that I was there in Yugoslavia as ambassador from '89 to '92, and particularly the long conversations that I had with the various leaders, the leaders in the different republics, particularly Serbia, Croatia, and Bosnia. I didn't really know it at the time, but it turned out to be a historic moment in European history because Yugoslavia became the first country in post-World War II Europe to perish. Of course, the Soviet Union followed shortly thereafter, but there were major differences between Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a centralized autocracy. It was an ethnic dictatorship by Russians against the other nationalities. It was an ideological dictatorship of the Communist Party, and it was a colonial empire. Yugoslavia was none of those things, and therefore the argument can be made that Yugoslavia shouldn't have perished. The thesis that I want to develop here is that Yugoslavia died not because of ancient ethnic hostilities, not because of the collapse of communism, which, for example, changed the political systems in countries like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, and not because of Western failure. All of those factors were present and were important in the death of Yugoslavia and the three wars culminating in the bloody debacle of Bosnia that followed. But none of them was the primary reason, in my view, for the death of a country and for the wars that followed. What killed Yugoslavia, I think, were the conscious actions of nationalist leaders. I've tried to capture in the book the long conversations I had with those leaders to try to convey a flavor of the characters they were and of the things, some of them extraordinary things, that they were prepared to see. I realize in retrospect that I was seeing different faces of evil. I don't say that all of these people were evil. No human being is probably totally evil, but certainly they represented different kinds of evil. And I want to talk a little bit about them in a very personal way. First of all is Slobodan Milosevic, who was, during the time I was in Yugoslavia and still is, the president of Serbia. I would describe him as representing evil as theater. As in the theater, nothing about Milosevic is exactly the way it seems. He's very presentable to Westerners, particularly to Western business people. He dresses in a Western style. He has an affable manner, and his vices are clubby vices. He smokes Italian cigarillos and he drinks scotch. But he is also, as almost everybody who has met him has had reason to discover, a master of deception. He conveys the most convincing earnestness when he is telling the most barefaced and monstrous lies. It's not that Milosevic is opposed to the truth. It's just that for him, the truth has an instrumental value. It's an instrument. Where it's useful to him, he will use it. Where it's not useful to him, he won't use it. Now, what is the evil that Milosevic represents? To me, it's that he tried to dominate Yugoslavia in the interests of Serbia, but more precisely in his own interest. And when he failed to dominate Yugoslavia because of the opposition of the Croats and the Slovenes, he tried to annex territory of other republics in which Serbs lived. And I put his responsibility for the three wars that followed higher than the responsibility of any of the other people that I will talk about tonight. The war in Croatia was over Milosevic's attempt to tear away a third of that republic. The war in Bosnia was over his attempt to tear away two-thirds of a republic in which Serbs at the beginning of the war represented only 31% of the population. The second kind of evil I want to describe is represented by Franjo Tudjman, now as then the president of Croatia. I'll call this evil as operetta. Tudjman is a scowling, humorless, pompous, vain leader. He reminds me of the wicked count in some Lehar operetta. Tudjman loved display. He personally supervised the reconstruction of the provincial palace where the ruler of Croatia in the 19th century lived. He personally selected every stick of furniture and every painting for that palace. He's a former general, and he adored uniforms, all kinds of military ceremony and panoply. He wears uniforms himself at every occasion that he can. Once I was with him in his palace at noon, as the clock struck noon, and Tudjman rose to his feet, and I had to do the same, of course, because they were changing the guard outside the palace. Tudjman had created a Republican guard of 6'6" tall Croatian men wearing resplendent red uniforms, which Tudjman, of course, had designed himself, and he stood at attention while the guard was changed. What was Tudjman's evil? It was, first of all, to deprive the Serbs who lived in Croatia, who constituted about 12% of the population, of their basic civil rights. When he won the election of 1990, he set about very quickly, and his people set about very quickly, in humiliating the Serbian population in Croatia. He schemed with Milosevic, his sworn enemy, to divide Bosnia leaving the Muslims, who were over 40% of the population, no home at all. The third kind of evil I want to discuss is that represented by Radovan Karadzic, now as then the leader of the Bosnian Serbs. And I will call this kind of evil as psychosis. The irony of Karadzic is that he is a psychiatrist. I have to say, I have never in my life met a more deranged or psychotic person. But then I'm not a psychiatrist, so maybe I don't know. To me, Karadzic is a racist of classical proportions. His view, which he explained to me many times, was that Serbs embodied all the human virtues, valor, honesty, compassion. Of course, those are Serbian virtues throughout history, but this is not a complete picture, obviously. Compassion, he kept talking about Serbian compassion. He would say, Mr. Zimmermann, you have to understand that Serbs are incapable of hatred. And he was saying this at the outset of a war in which those who answered to him were to kill upwards of 100,000 Muslims and Croats. Karadzic himself was capable of hatred. He would recall to me the days of the Nazi puppet state of Croatia in the 40s and say that all Croats today are fascists. He said that the Muslims, all Muslims in Yugoslavia, are duplicitous and a conniving wedge of the Islamic effort to dominate Europe. Karadzic's evil is that he was the primary author of the policy of ethnic cleansing, the modus operandi of which was to attack Muslim villages, to kill the civilian population or to expel them to form the largest refugee population in Europe since World War II. Karadzic, of course, with General Mladic, the commander of the Bosnian Serb forces, has been indicted by the War Crimes Tribunal. There's another interesting aspect about Karadzic. I think he is another proof of the view that the most rabid nationalists are often people who don't come from the area where their nationalism is rooted. Karadzic himself is not a Bosnian. He comes from Montenegro, a neighboring republic, just as Napoleon was not French, Stalin was not Russian, and Hitler was not German. I would like to try to get across to you that these men did not appear to me at the time, and to some degree even now, as inhuman or unhuman. I played tennis with Tudjman. He always showed me enormous hospitality in Croatia. Milosevic had a lot of charm, which I think impressed most of the Westerners who talked to him and got to know him. And Karadzic, for all his psychoses, could affect a very gentle manner in talking to people. Yet these three men, who are all of them still in power, were capable of the most extraordinarily monstrous acts. They see nothing wrong in sacrificing human lives to their grandiose objectives. For them, individual people are just pawns in their racist strategies. Since people count for nothing to them, they're disposable. And there I think you get the ideological or the philosophical underpinning for the horrendous killing that went on by all sides in Bosnia. How could such monsters have received such a popular following? That's a big question, and my book goes into it in greater detail than I will here. The question is not dissimilar from the old question from World War II: how could ordinary Germans support Hitler, and even, as is the thesis of a new and controversial book, commit atrocities themselves? How could, for example, 1 million Austrians have turned out on the Hofburg Square in Vienna in March 1938, when Hitler made his triumphant appearance in Austria? 1 million Austrians was 1/8 of the population of Austria, all there together. What is there about demagogues that attracts people? I think in the case of Yugoslavia, there are several possible answers. The first is that not everybody did follow Milosevic or Tudjman or Karadzic. The book goes into some detail about the people who didn't follow them, about the people who opposed them. And you found those people everywhere. You found them particularly in Belgrade and in Zagreb. Courageous newspaper editors who refused to buckle under to the efforts to control the press by Milosevic. I recall one, for example, Gordana Logar, a small woman who seemed very meek, who was the editor-in-chief of Borba, which was the last independent newspaper in Belgrade. When Milosevic tried to take it over in December of 1993, she refused to give up the office, and when the police just took it over from her, she immediately went to another location in town and started up another newspaper, which is still going. I mean, an extraordinarily brave woman. She gets death threats. Her daughter got death threats periodically. The same kind of people opposed and still oppose Tudjman in Croatia. And one of the bright parts, I think, of the Bosnian elections, which were not particularly which did not particularly have bright results, was that the opposition candidate to the Karadzic-picked candidate did quite well. So I think it's not quite fair to say that all Serbs or all Croats supported these people. Many of them didn't, and many of them still don't. But as in most authoritarian societies, it's very hard to be active in opposition because all the tools of control are in the hands of the leader, the army, the police, even the economic system, in the case of Milosevic and Tudjman, and the opposition is very easy to marginalize, and of course that's what's happened in Serbia and Croatia. The second possible answer to why these demagogues had a following is that, this may be a paradox, but the very ethnic similarities among Serbs, Croats, and Muslims may have increased the hostility between them. There's very little, some people would say no, real ethnic difference among these different groups. Konrad Lorenz, the great biologist, has said that aggression is only possible between members of the same species. Charles Dickens, in writing A History of England, said that the Wars of the Roses, that British English Civil War of the 15th century, proved that men are never so unnaturally cruel as when they are fighting people of the same race. So it may be the similarities themselves that have made things so violent. Of course, we have our own example of the U.S. Civil War, which was an extraordinary bloody war with many atrocities. But the third point, and I think the most important reason why these demagogues had a following, was that they practiced an ethnic nationalism from the top down and they were able to disseminate it through almost total control of the media, particularly television. I don't think nearly enough attention has been paid to the power of television in an ethnically tense situation and area. I don't know why, but television has an extraordinary credibility that the radio and the printed press simply don't have. I can remember seeing television pictures of bloody corpses in Belgrade and seeing the same televised pictures of the same corpses in Zagreb. In the one case, they're identified as Serbs who have died at the hands of Croats. In the other case, they're identified as Croats who have died at the hands of Serbs. There was no doubt that the Serbian audience completely believed the one thing, the Croatian audience completely believed the other thing. Milosevic was particularly good at manipulating television. And it's not, I think, by chance that one of the first acts in the Bosnian War, when the Bosnian Serbs were doing very well because the Muslims did not have, at that point, much of an army, one of their first acts was to take the television transmitters and turn them toward Belgrade so they could pick up the Belgrade signal so that that would be disseminated throughout Bosnia. The content of these television messages was to play on the fears of the ethnic group that you're beaming the pictures to. Of course, there were plenty of fears. Yugoslavia has had a bloody history. In World War II, over 500,000 Yugoslavs were killed by other Yugoslavs, and that's still fresh in the memory of many. So if you play on fear, if you're the dictator in control of the media, you can do a pretty complete job of getting people to radicalize their own views. I mean, the argument would be, and you'd hear it both from Serbian and Croatian television, is we've got to kill the other side before they kill us first. The other thing about television I want to mention is that these horrible emissions have poisoned not just an adult generation or two, but children as well, because they weren't reserved till late night when the children had gone to bed. They were beamed at 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock in the evening, times when the children would be watching television. So God knows the kind of impression that children are going to draw from this drumbeat of impressions of horrendous violence and cruelty, always blamed on the other ethnic group. We are dealing not only with geographical violence here, we are dealing with a kind of a vertical violence projected forward in time for another 20 or perhaps 30 years because it is ingrained, embedded in the minds of children who are not even old enough to serve in the army yet. Now, there's nothing to me unique about any of this. You hear people say all the time, and I think it's, a bit racist to say it. Well, that's the Balkans. The Balkans have always been full of this kind of violence. You can't do anything about it. That's the way those people are. I don't think there's any Balkan gene that makes people who come from that part of the world any more violent than anybody else. I think they're humans the way everybody is, and that they are simply coming under the kinds of pressures that would be very hard for anybody in this country to resist. I have a good friend who's a Serb and one of the editors of an independent magazine in Belgrade, the only one really in Serbia, who has said several times, and he said it to me, he said, we're not so different from you. If the Ku Klux Klan controlled American television for a 5-year period and you didn't see anything but what they wanted you to see, you'd all be racist too. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. Now, what does all this mean for Bosnia and for the elections which have just taken place in the last 10 days? I believe that the war in Bosnia was primarily, I don't say exclusively, but primarily a war of aggression waged by Serbia and by the Bosnian Serbs, led by Karadzic, against the Muslim population of Bosnia. I don't say the Muslims were blame-free. They certainly weren't. But that is primarily what it was, in my view. And the issue of Bosnia was whether Bosnia should remain a multi-ethnic state or be cut up into ethnically cleansed, ethnically pure units, two of which, the Serbian unit and the Croatian unit, could someday join Serbia and Croatia. The Muslims supported the idea of maintaining Bosnia as an ethnically integrated state. That idea was opposed by the Serbian and Croatian nationalists. The Muslims naturally turned to the United States for help because, in their view, and I think in mine and maybe all of ours, we have the most successfully ethnically integrated country in the world. The U.S., in fact, had the capability to save many of the tens of thousands of lives lost in Bosnia. I believe that if the Bush administration had used airstrikes against Serbian military installations in the summer of 1992, as the Clinton administration did in the summer of 1995, that there would have been very quickly a negotiated settlement which would have left the map of Bosnia more to the liking of the Muslims, who did represent 12% more of the population than the Serbs and 26% more of the population than the Croats. But that didn't happen, and it was not until very late in the day that the U.S. intervened decisively with airstrikes and helped to bring about the Dayton Agreement. Let me say a bit about Dayton before I get to the elections themselves. The Dayton Agreement, signed about a year ago, was an uneasy compromise which really didn't solve any of the problems that the war was being fought over. The major achievement of the Dayton Agreement in 1 year's retrospect has been that it has kept the ceasefire intact, that there has been no fighting in Bosnia for over a year now. And that's a major achievement, I think, given that there were 4 years of fighting with over 100,000 dead. That's a conservative estimate, 100,000. There was something for both sides in the Dayton Agreement, and given the lateness at which it was negotiated, there had to be something for both sides. For those who wanted to keep Bosnia unified, that was primarily the Muslims and most of the Western countries, including the United States. Dayton provided the framework for a sovereign state of Bosnia, for a presidency consisting of a member of each of 3 ethnic groups, parliament, a court system, a national bank, a currency, and so forth. It established the elections, which took place a week ago last Saturday, which were designed to give life to all of these institutions, to make, in effect, Bosnia a real sovereign state. It provided for the return of refugees to places where they had lived before, or for their resettlement in places where they might want to live if they didn't want to go home. It encouraged the arrest and prosecution of war criminals, and it established a NATO force to preserve the peace. For those who wanted to partition Bosnia, which was probably, but both the Serbian and the Croatian side. The Serbs got their own republic, the Republika Srpska, which no previous Western negotiating position had ever given them. So they got more out of Dayton than they would have gotten out of the Vance-Owen plan or the previous contact group plan or any of the other plans that were devised before. They got their own republic within or under the umbrella of a sovereign Bosnia. It covers 49% of the territory of Bosnia, and I will remind you that the Serbian population in 1991, before the war began, was about 31% of the population of Bosnia. For those who wanted separation, Dayton allowed the existence of three armies in a sovereign state, a Serbian, a Croatian, and a Bosnian army, Muslim army. And finally, Dayton failed to put any mechanism in place which would block any ultimate decision to divide Bosnia between Serbia and Croatia. So you had a very mixed and complex and basically unsatisfactory result. The elections took place in peaceful conditions, something I have to reiterate, but also they took place in what I would call a deteriorating environment, at least deteriorating for those who had some hopes of holding Bosnia together. In the first place, refugees have been intimidated from returning to their homes. So there's been very little refugee return to their homes. Secondly, freedom of movement in general has been very limited. The NATO force has done very little to guarantee that, just as it has done very little to ensure that refugees could go back to their homes. Third, the media remain in the untender hands of the nationalist extremists of all three parties. The media in Bosnia are not free, and they are controlled by people who do not have a very strong vested interest in keeping Bosnia together. Minor exception of Muslims, although they themselves have grown much more extreme in the conditions of the war. Fourth, ethnic cleansing continues at least as big a pace as it did even during the war. And fifth, the two most prominent war criminals, indicted war criminals in Bosnia, Karadzic and Mladic, have not been arrested, and there seems to be no inclination at all of the NATO force to arrest them. The elections were won by the large nationalist parties in the Federation, which is the Muslim and Croatian area, and in the Republika Srpska. So everything is in place, if you want to take a pessimistic view, to continue the process that could lead to the partition of Bosnia. Would the partition of Bosnia be a good idea, since that seems to be the way things are headed? It's certainly the way the governments in power in what was clearly not a democratic election want things to turn out. I think it would be a disaster to partition Bosnia. In the first place, nobody would be able to agree exactly on how it ought to be partitioned, because the Dayton map was not popular with any of the sides except possibly with the Croats. So there would be disputes over the territory, which could very quickly lead to violence, because three armies in Bosnia are still intact. But even more than that, there's the geopolitical fact that the partition of Bosnia would leave the Muslims with much less territory than they, together with the Croats, have now. And that would mean, I think almost certainly, you would have the real danger of Islamic fundamentalism in Europe. I don't think it was a real danger even during, it certainly was not a danger before the war. I don't think it was a real danger during the war. But if the results of the peace settlement produce a result which is clearly unfair to the Muslims, as the division of Bosnia between Croatia and Serbia would be, then I think there's no doubt that the radical elements in the major Muslim party would take over, would invite the Iranians in, maybe the Libyans. The Iranians are already there, partly, but this would be big time. And you would get not only an unstable situation in the Balkans with clear violence about to happen again, but you could get terrorism in Europe and even in North America because of the view of the Muslims in Bosnia that they were sold out by the West. So I think partition, although it seems to be the direction things are going in, would be a disaster, would not produce a peaceful outcome, would actually make things worse, and could even bring the Bosnian crisis to the West in a way that it hasn't been before. Now, what would it take to prevent such an outcome? Is it possible to prevent such an outcome? I think it's possible. It's an uphill battle. But if the United States is not prepared to take a prominent role, then it would be defeating the very objective that it devoted its military commitment to Bosnia for in the first place, which was to try to preserve the principle of ethnic tolerance and a multi-ethnic, unified, or at least integral Bosnia. I think it will take two actions on the part of the American government. The first would be a decision to continue the presence of the NATO force and to continue the participation of American troops in it. I don't argue that the force has to be in the same numbers as are there now, or that the American forces, who have, by the way, suffered virtually no casualties, would have to remain in the same numbers they are now. But it's clear to me, and I think it is clear to a number of observers, that the Bosnians are not yet in a position to run their own affairs. They need more time, and it seems to me it would be an act of Western negligence to walk away, washing our hands of the situation right now. The second thing that I think is necessary is that there have to be different rules of engagement for the NATO force. Its primary function was quite narrowly defined for the first year to keep the peace, and it did do that, but it did almost nothing else. I think it's going to have to get into some of these political areas. For example, to guarantee freedom of movement, to ensure that refugees can actually go back to areas where they lived. There ought to be a mechanism, and perhaps the Europeans can work on this, to monitor the media and to try to ensure that they are more independent and objective than they are. In other words, the Western focus needs to shift now from the military focus that characterized the NATO force for the first year to a political focus. That's not going to be easy. And by the way, I think there has to be some serious effort to arrest some of the major war criminals, because like it or not, the War Crimes Tribunal exists, and if it exists, there has to be some action taken to deliver people to it. This renewed commitment, or this continued commitment with a refocusing, doesn't give a positive, it doesn't guarantee a positive outcome, obviously. But I do think it would help enormously. And on the contrary, early NATO withdrawal would lead to an acceleration, certainly, of the trend I've tried to identify toward ethnic partition and, I think, violence. In fact, the hints we're getting from the administration, from the Clinton administration, are leave us alone till after the election, and if we win, we will maintain a U.S. military presence in Bosnia. I hope that's right. Nobody has actually said it right out publicly, so we can't be sure. But this is a situation in which the United States, as the largest successful multi-ethnic country in the world, has to play a role. We tried to hand off to the Europeans, and that failed because they failed. So we have to be involved in it. I'd like to end by reading a poem that I think makes the point about the importance of large, powerful countries helping small and defenseless countries. It was written by W.H. Auden in the 30s, before World War II, but I think it has a good deal of relevance to the situation in Bosnia today, as you'll hear. It takes place on the lawn of an embassy. The poem is called Embassy. It takes place on the lawn of an embassy, and one imagines that engaged in conversation are two senior diplomats, foreign ministry officials of large Western countries. This is how it goes. As evening fell, the day's oppression lifted. Far peaks came into focus. It had rained. Across wide lawns and cultured flowers drifted the conversation of the highly trained. Two gardeners watched them pass and priced their shoes. A chauffeur waited, reading in the drive, for them to finish their exchange of views. It seemed a picture of the private life. Far off, no matter what good they intended, the armies waited for a verbal error with all the instruments for causing pain. And on the issue of their charm depended a land laid waste with all its young men slain, its women weeping, and its towns in terror. Thank you. I'll be very happy to take questions. The question was, are the satellite countries, Macedonia and Montenegro, involved? Montenegro is a part of the Yugoslav Republic, of which Serbia is also a part. So they are involved, they're involved to the extent Serbia is involved. Macedonia is a somewhat different situation. It has been on the sidelines of the Bosnian War, but it is very sensitive to whatever happens in Kosovo, which is the Albanian province of Serbia. If Kosovo blew up, the Albanian population of Macedonia, which is probably a quarter or a third of the population of Macedonia, would certainly be affected. If a greater Albania was created, for example, out of the partition of Kosovo, that would have an effect on Macedonia too, because the Albanian population of Macedonia would almost certainly want to join it. So the paradox is that Macedonia has not been very sensitive to what's going on in Bosnia. And there was, of course, a U.S. force in Macedonia, which was probably a help to keeping stability there. But Macedonia is extremely vulnerable to what might happen with Kosovo. The question is, why didn't the European countries get in there sooner? Is it because they didn't know what to do, or because they didn't care? To some degree, it was because they didn't know what to do, I think, and it was very hard, as Yugoslavia was breaking up, to know exactly what to do. But in some ways, they knew what to do, and they made a calculated decision not to do it. For example, when the European community recognized Croatia and Slovenian independence in December of 1991. It was an act of tremendous irresponsibility because there was still some possibility of negotiating settlements that would include Bosnia as well. But they went ahead and did it. I think the Europeans have a lot to answer for in this, and I will say particularly the British. The British position was to stay out, as far out as possible. And one of the ways they invented for staying out was to put a peacekeeping force in Bosnia, and then argue with us that we couldn't bomb because that would put the peacekeepers in jeopardy. So there was a kind of a the peacekeeping force was seen by the British as a kind of a vaccination against the assertion of American force, which would have actually done some good. It did in August of '95, and it would have as early as '92. So the Germans were also irresponsible. They retreated behind their constitution, which said they could not get militarily involved in any country, but they were the ones who pushed hardest for the recognition of Croatia and Slovenia, which created an enormous crisis for which the Germans then took no responsibility and walked away from because they said they couldn't get involved because of their constitution. So I don't think, I don't have much good to say for the Europeans in this. And unfortunately, if we had left it to them, the war would still be going on, I think. The fact that the United States was prepared finally to pursue a campaign of limited airstrikes, together with a number of other factors that came together in the summer of 1995, made it possible to end the war. The Europeans would not have been able to do it, and they were not pursuing a policy that would have done it. You have, we're talking about different tribes, Croat, Serbian, Muslim tribes, but aren't the Muslims either Croats or Serbs? An argument can be made that there is virtually no ethnic difference between any of the three, among any of the three major nationalities, but there is certainly no ethnic difference between the Muslims and either Serbs or Croats. Because when the Turks came into Bosnia in the 15th century, they found Serbs and Croats. The Serbs and Croats who wanted to make their peace with the Turks and perhaps, lead a quieter life if they did so, became Muslims, and they are their descendants are the Bosnian Muslims. There is no ethnic difference between the Bosnian Muslims and either Serbs or Croats. That's not the case with other Muslim populations in Yugoslavia. The Albanians, for example, who are also nominally Muslim, are different ethnically altogether. They're not even Slavs. But in Bosnia, the Muslims they're not an ethnic group. They were created as one of Yugoslavia's nationalities by Tito for strategic reasons, probably. The question is, why wasn't the arms embargo lifted? I was opposed to the lifting of the arms embargo. It's not because I didn't sympathize with the Muslim position, because I did, but because I thought it would actually make things worse. In the first place, the Muslims were getting all kinds of arms, except for the very heaviest kinds of arms, from through Croatia and through other sources, mostly coming from Iran and the Middle East. And if you had lifted the arms embargo, as the Senate and the House threatened to do several times, my view of what would have happened is that would have given the Serbian forces in Bosnia a tremendous incentive to move quickly to finish the war. And they certainly had the power to do that because they had the whole Yugoslav army sitting in Serbia, which could have moved across. That would have been, I think, a challenge to finish the war quickly. And then the Muslims would have come running to the United States and have said, you have to bail us out. So, in fact, lifting the arms embargo was seen in the Congress, I believe, as a kind of a free lunch. You can do something that makes you feel good about helping the Muslims, while at the same time screening yourself off from any direct American participation. I don't think it would have worked that way. I was much more in favor of a short, sharp campaign of U.S. airstrikes, which would have conveyed a much clearer message than lifting the arms embargo and wouldn't have had the problems that would have been associated with lifting the arms embargo. The question is, the premise of the question is the Clinton administration acted as it did out of political reasons, and do we have any assurance that after the election, if they get reelected, they will stay with it, or will they just walk away? I don't think there's any assurance. The hints one hears from the administration is that they will be prepared to keep a small American force there, which is positive, I think. The administration today, as always, has been divided on Bosnia. There have been hawks like Madeleine Albright, Vice President Gore. There have been those who have not wanted us to be involved, primarily from the Defense Department and the uniformed military. There have been others who have kind of wavered back and forth, like Secretary Christopher. I think Strobe Talbot maybe is on the more hawkish side. I think it will depend a good deal on who is in charge in the new administration, who the major figures are, and also the degree to which the president feels that Bosnia is an important issue. I think he's had quite a steep learning curve on Bosnia. I don't think he feels he can walk away from it the way he did in the early part of his administration. So I think there's at least some hope that Bosnia will remain a major foreign policy issue. Whether the administration will do the right thing or not is anybody's guess. I was asked to describe my efforts to encourage reconciliation among the peoples of Yugoslavia. Yes, I'll do it. I'll do it in as shorthanded way as I can, because it's gone into in greater detail in the book. The American strategy, this was Bush administration now, was to try to find a way to hold Yugoslavia together in a democratic way. Because our analysis, which turned out to be correct, was that if Yugoslavia broke up, it would break up violently. Therefore, was there a way to hold it together in a non-nationalist way? And we tried to do it with support for the then Yugoslav prime minister, who was a Croatian businessman and politician named Markovic, who had basically Western views about economic development, and he was perfectly willing to pay attention to what the Western countries told him on human rights and so forth. He'd been a communist. So we basically put our eggs in his basket, but it was too late. It wasn't going to work. And I spent a lot of time in all the republics, including Slovenia, which was the first republic to secede, and which has, I didn't mention it in the talk, but has an enormous responsibility for what later happened. Because the Slovenes kind of dragged the Croats into it. The Croats might have hesitated more if the Slovenes hadn't been so assertive about going for independence. I was in these Republican capitals just all the time, trying to jawbone people into supporting a democratic Yugoslav solution. And it was in vain, unfortunately. I still think it was the right thing to do. It taught me a lesson in diplomacy, which is sometimes there isn't an answer to everything. And I don't think there was an answer to this, because the power of nationalism was already so strong, particularly in Serbia and Croatia, and to some degree in Slovenia, that it made it impossible to get that kind of solution. So that's a brief view of what we tried to do.
On behalf of the audience, Mr. Ambassador, I'd like to thank you for advancing our understanding considerably. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.